This video is an overview on how to sell property, real estate that you own, for sale by owner in California. And actually, it's not largely different than the rest of the country, but this video is done from a California perspective, and it'll give you an overview of the timeline and the steps of what goes into the process to sell your property by owner. This will be a short slideshow, but by the end of it, I am confident that you'll feel more comfortable knowing about what you're getting into. So we'll jump right into it. All right, now sometimes I talk to sellers that already have a buyer. Maybe the tenant is buying the rental that they're living in. Maybe the seller, through one way or another, has found the buyer. That's great. For those of you that haven't found a buyer, you'll want to list in the MLS. Now, you don't necessarily need an agent to do it. There are many companies, ours included, that you can pay a flat fee to get a posting or to have your listing published in the MLS. And you'll want to make sure you have professional photos, or if not professional, at least professional grade photos. You want to have very flattering photos of your property. And really posting in the MLS with nice photos is 90+% of marketing a property. Everyone is looking there. Buyers that are looking without an agent are looking on Zillow and Realtor.com and all those sites. And all those sites are just getting listings from the MLS. And buyers that are using agents, which is most of them, because it's free for a buyer to use an agent, that agent's looking on the MLS. So everyone's looking at the MLS. That's where all the attention's directed. So if you're looking for a buyer, that's where you need to go. Now, if you have a buyer, or you have a buyer agent that has made an offer through your listing, you're going to need to negotiate the offer. Now, negotiating the offer isn't necessarily just the sales price. You're negotiating the buyer's EMD, earnest money deposit, which is typically 1 to 3% of the sales price. The escrow period, 30 days, 45 days, maybe less if it's a cash offer. You're negotiating all the closing costs, and those vary dramatically, geographically speaking. So, for example, in Southern California, the seller pays most of the closing costs. In Northern California, it varies county by county. And we have a grid or a matrix that has a breakdown of who customarily pays closing costs in which part of California. And I'll link to that. I'll link to all this in the description. But that's all being negotiated. And even though it's customary that one party or another pays it in a certain area, all that's negotiable as well. But the point is that a buyer is going to present an offer. The seller can either agree or counter it. And if the seller counters it, the buyer, of course, can agree and counter that. The parties can go back and forth as needed until they've honed down those terms, until they're mutually agreeable. And then when the last party signs, meaning the last signature is needed to have both party signatures on the document, that's when you have an accepted offer, and that's day 0 of your escrow period. And you'll deliver that offer to an escrow company. And then the escrow company, they're going to ask the buyer to deliver their earnest money deposit within 3 business days. That's the deposit to get the transaction going. Again, that's 1 to 3%, and that's delivered by the buyer to escrow. Now, once you're in escrow, the buyer on their end, they're going to be looking into. So let's start with this. Let's say you have an accepted offer. You've opened escrow. I'll start with what the buyer's doing. The buyer's getting all their paperwork to their lender to get a loan, unless it's a cash transaction. The buyer's also scheduling their home inspection. They're going to have an inspector. Now, of course, that isn't always the case, but I'm telling you what is usually the case on almost all transactions. So the buyer's going to have their home inspector, and they're going to set up an inspection. Now, you as the seller, you have 7 days from acceptance to prepare all the disclosures. And I'll link to the disclosure package. Even if you don't get it from us, you can see what all forms are involved, because there are many, many forms required by state law that the seller is obligated to furnish the buyer. And you have 7 days to prepare those and then deliver those to the buyer. Now, also, typically, a termite report is requested by the buyer's agent or the person writing the offer. And the seller usually has to order the termite inspection. So in this first 7 days, in addition to doing disclosures, the seller is going to want to order a termite inspection as well, if the offer calls for it. If it doesn't, then it's up to the buyer to do that. All right, now, so let's say you, as a seller, you have delivered the disclosures, the buyer's done their inspection. Now, typically, the buyer is going to come back to you with a to-do list. Can you please make these repairs? And the seller can choose to do it or not. They can use a repair. So we have forms for all this, but there's usually a request for repairs form or something comparable from the buyer saying, our inspection showed that X, Y, and Z are wrong with the property. Hey, seller, can you fix it or can you give us a credit to make those repairs? And it's up to you as a seller to decide what you want to do. Do you want to fix it or do you want to just say no, take it as is? That's what's being negotiated on these forms. They're almost like counteroffers in the middle of escrow. And then once the parties have come to a decision about what repairs will be done, or maybe no repairs at all, well, then the buyer needs to remove contingencies. Built into every offer, there's a contingency period for the buyer to do investigations and get their appraisal and get their loan in order, their mortgage in order. Now, if any, in this time, when you have these contingency periods in an offer, the buyer can back out and the buyer will not lose their deposit. Well, at a certain point, the seller's been waiting and the seller needs to say, listen, you've had time to do your inspection. You've had time for your lender to do an appraisal and you've had time to get your affairs in order with your lender to obtain a loan. I can't wait forever. You need to make a commitment. And that typically happens after 17 days of being in escrow. All this, everything I'm talking about, you can reference in the forms. And leave a comment in the video and I'll respond if you have more questions. But after that contingency period's up, the buyer has to say in writing that they hereby remove all contingencies to the seller. And then at that point, their deposit becomes non-refundable. So let's say repairs were agreed upon. The buyer has removed their contingencies. Let's say we're about 20 days into the escrow period. What happens next? Well, really the seller is doing a lot of waiting. I mean, once the buyer has removed contingencies, everyone's just waiting on the buyer's lender to perform. And that's what takes all this time. I mean, we're doing an imaginary 30-day escrow here, but if there was no lender involved, this could be closed in 7 days. This could be a much faster escrow. So now that we're 20 days in, we're imagining we're 20 days in, and the buyer's removed contingencies, the deposit's not refundable. Well, the seller needs to follow up with escrow, make sure all their paperwork is done. Has the seller signed and notarized the grant deed? Has the seller signed all their final paperwork with escrow? As a seller, there are two groups of paperwork. There's your agency paperwork, which includes all your disclosures that you're required by the state to deliver to the buyer. But then there's also escrow paperwork, which is more of a group of financial documents that pertain to your home sale. There'll be tax forms in there. There'll be forms about your net proceeds at closing. There'll be verifications of ownership. But there's basically another group of forms from escrow. So as a seller, while you're waiting, you'll want to make sure that all your paperwork with escrow is done. Aside from that, you're planning your next move. Are you packing? Have you lined up where you're moving to? Have you scheduled the movers to come? That's really what you're doing in this last leg of the transaction, which is basically what I just said. So I kind of combined it into both these slides into the last slide. But that's it. In addition to doing your escrow paperwork, you're just waiting and you're packing and you're checking with the buyer and making sure their financing is good and the buyer has signed the loan docs. You're checking with escrow and asking escrow to make sure that the buyer's being responsive as well. And then once the buyer's loan funds and it records with the county, then you're closing. And that's when escrow is going to send you your net proceeds. You're going to have them wired to your account. And the buyer's going to then become the owner of the property. And the day it records with the county, ownership has recorded, the deed, I mean, what we're talking about is the grant deed has recorded with the county. At 6 p.m. that day, you as the seller, you're going to deliver the buyer or the buyer's agent keys and garage door openers and mailbox keys and whatever other remotes there are. And the buyer is then going to take possession. And that's it. That is the transaction. And questions do come up along the way. We're here to answer them. If you have questions on anything I've talked about in this video, please leave a comment. And I'll put links to a bunch of resources in the description. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you for watching.